In 2009, a routine thermal satellite pass over the Western Sahara captured something that shouldn't exist. Geometric trenches running 43 miles across bedrock, visible only when the sun angle and surface temperature aligned in a narrow window twice per year. The trenches weren't erosion, they were parallel grooves, uniformly spaced at 8 to 12 feet apart, cutting through compressed sandstone in straight lines that held their course across elevation changes, dried riverbeds, and ancient dune formations that had long since turned to stone. French geological survey teams photographed the same formations in 1952. Their technical reports filed the images under unexplained erosional features and recommended no follow-up investigation. The same year, international forestry conferences stopped referencing pre-desert vegetation in North Africa entirely. The silence wasn't gradual, it was coordinated. Within 18 months, academic papers that had routinely discussed Saharan paleobotany began citing insufficient data and redirecting research funding toward Mediterranean and sub-Saharan zones instead. Something industrial happened here before the sand arrived, and the response wasn't confusion, it was containment. The standard story is clean. The Sahara desertified gradually over 5,000 years as climate patterns shifted and monsoon belts moved south. Vegetation disappeared naturally as rainfall declined. No major industrial activity could have existed in this region during ancient times. The narrative holds because it requires nothing uncomfortable. It asks no one to reconsider the capabilities of pre-classical civilizations or the scale of resource extraction that might have preceded the historical record. It allows the desert to remain a victim of climate rather than a consequence of use. But in 1978, NASA's Landsat program captured images of massive circular depressions in Mauritania. Each depression measured 2 to 3 miles in diameter. Geologists initially classified them as meteor impact craters or volcanic calderas because both explanations fit the scale and the circular geometry. The problem appeared when closer analysis found no impact debris, no shattered quartz, no volcanic rock, and no residual thermal signature in the underlying strata. What the formations did have was radial scarring emanating outward from the center, like something had been extracted in a controlled, sustained operation. The patterns matched industrial quarrying, mechanized, systematic removal of material from a central point outward in concentric rings, but at a scale that would require machinery absent from every museum collection, every historical record, and every accepted timeline of technological development. The depressions weren't random, they followed a grid pattern across 200 miles of desert terrain, spaced at intervals that suggested planned placement rather than natural occurrence. This is where the story stops being about climate and starts being about what was taken. Henri Lot was a French colonial surveyor working near Tassili-Nadjer in 1923 when he documented what he called megalithic timber remnants embedded in sandstone cliff formations. His field reports describe petrified wood fragments more than 40 feet in diameter, preserved in sedimentary layers that suggested rapid burial rather than gradual fossilization. He measured them, he photographed them, he catalogued their positions across 17 sites within a 30-mile radius. The fragments showed clean separation planes, not the irregular breaks of wind-felled timber, but cuts that suggested deliberate sectioning. His supervisor ordered him to reclassify them as unusual rock formations in the official records. Lahoti complied, but he kept his original notes separate from the institutional archive. Those notes vanished from the Paris Colonial Archives sometime between 1941 and 1944, during a period when large sections of North African survey data were transferred, reorganized, or selectively destroyed. Loti died in 1991. He never published the full dataset. In his private correspondence, discovered decades later in a family collection, he referred to the formations as the cut forest, but never explained what he meant by that phrase or why he believed the wood had been cut rather than fallen naturally. In one letter to a colleague, dated 1956, he wrote, "The supervisors know what they're protecting. It isn't French interest. It's older than that. The grooves in the Saharan trenches tell a more specific story than erosion allows. Cross-section analysis of exposed trench walls reveals repeating groove patterns inside the cuts, parallel score marks running horizontally along the trench depth, spaced at intervals that suggest massive rotating teeth or segmented blades. The marks aren't weathered smooth. They retain edge definition sharp enough to measure the pitch and spacing of whatever tool created them. The depth consistency across miles indicates sustained mechanical pressure, not the irregular action of wind, water, or freeze-thaw cycles. A 2003 independent geology study published preliminary findings calculating the tensile force required to produce cuts of that depth and uniformity in compressed sandstone. The numbers suggested machinery equivalent to modern industrial excavators scaled up by a factor of 10, drive systems capable of maintaining continuous cutting pressure across distances that would require coordinated operation, not isolated manual effort. The study was retracted 6 months after publication. No explanation was provided. The lead researcher, a tenured professor at a French technical university, did not publish again. His university biography was later amended to remove all reference to the Saharan fieldwork. If these are tool marks, the next question is immediate. Where did the extracted material go? Examine the timing. Between 3000 BCE and 1200 BCE, the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern worlds experienced construction booms of a scale that required timber volumes regional forests could not supply. Egyptian temple complexes, Phoenician fleets, Minoan palaces, and early Mesopotamian urban centers consumed wood at rates that outpaced local regeneration by orders of magnitude. A single Egyptian temple could require more than 15,000 cubic meters of timber for roofing beams, scaffolding, and decorative elements. Phoenician shipbuilding operations in Byblos alone processed timber volumes that modern forestry estimates suggest would have required continuous harvest from forests covering more than 2,000 square miles. Egyptian administrative records reference wood from the western lands, but never specify location, species, or the logistics of transport across distances that would have required either impossible overland routes or undocumented shipping networks. Phoenician manifests from Byblos and Tyre list timber imports in staggering quantities with no origin documentation. Only the phrase "Western supply" repeated across centuries of trade records. The standard explanation points to Lebanese cedar, but the volumes don't reconcile. The cedar forests of the Levant were large but finite, and their depletion is well documented in later classical sources. Something else was feeding the construction engines of the Bronze Age Mediterranean, and the records carefully avoid saying what. Saharan rock strata contain a distinct compressed layer of organic material dated to roughly 2,500 to 1,500 BCE. The layer runs across more than 400,000 square miles, concentrated in bands that align with the major trench systems visible from satellite imaging. Mineralogical composition suggests rapid burial under silica-rich sediment, not the slow fossilization process that creates typical petrified wood. The compression patterns match those seen in industrial sawdust accumulation, fine particulate matter compacted under sustained weight and moisture, then mineralized as groundwater chemistry shifted and silica precipitation locked the material into stone. The layer averages 3 to 7 feet in thickness. Do the math. 7 feet of compressed sawdust across 400,000 square miles implies the processing of timber volumes that dwarf anything recorded in historical sources. The official explanation calls it an anomalous sedimentation event and declines further interpretation. But sawdust layers of this scale imply cutting operations conducted over decades, possibly centuries, with waste management logistics sophisticated enough to contain, compress, and bury the byproduct in concentrated zones rather than allowing it to disperse naturally across the landscape. The machinery isn't entirely theoretical. In 1897, a British archaeological team working near the ancient city of Meroe in Sudan uncovered bronze gearing mechanisms inside a collapsed stone structure that showed no other signs of technological sophistication. The gears were large, some more than 2 feet in diameter, and the tooth pattern suggested power transmission designed for heavy mechanical work rather than astronomical calculation or decorative function. The gear ratios implied a drive system capable of converting manual or animal input into rotational force at speeds high enough to power cutting or drilling equipment. One gear showed wear patterns consistent with sustained operational use, not ceremonial or occasional function. The findings were published once, in an obscure archaeological journal with limited circulation. The artifacts were transferred to British Museum storage and labelled ritual objects, a classification that ensured they would not be prioritised for further study or public display. A 2015 museum inventory audit listed the items as missing, likely discarded pre-1920. No photographs survive in the museum's accessible collections. The original excavation logs are not available for review. A Freedom of Information request filed in 2018 returned the response that records prior to 1925 were destroyed during wartime relocation procedures. Put the pieces in order. We're not talking about hand tools. We're not talking about animal-powered systems or primitive lever mechanics. The scale of the Saharan scarring requires coordinated industrial extraction sustained across multiple generations. It requires fuel sources capable of powering large-scale mechanical systems. It requires logistics networks capable of moving processed material across hundreds of miles to coastal distribution points. It requires labour forces numbering in the tens of thousands and a governing structure capable of multi-generational planning and resource allocation. If a civilization had that capacity, why is there no written record, no ruins, no commemorative architecture, no coinage, no identifiable cultural artifacts? The answer is simpler than it seems, because the operation wasn't commemorative, it was extractive. This wasn't empire building, this wasn't the construction of a society meant to endure and be remembered. This was resource harvesting on an industrial scale, and when the resources were exhausted, the operation dissolved. The workers dispersed, the infrastructure was dismantled or buried, and the client civilizations that had funded and benefited from the extraction had no incentive to memorialize a supply chain they preferred to keep invisible. The evidence suggests the Sahara wasn't a climate victim, it was a work site. And when the work was finished, the machinery was decommissioned, the labour forces scattered into the collapsing Bronze Age Mediterranean as refugees and economic migrants, and the official story that emerged centuries later treated the desert as a natural feature rather than a produced landscape. The trenches are still there. You can see them on satellite imaging if you know where to look and what atmospheric conditions reveal the thermal contrast. They're labelled as erosional features in every geological database. The groove patterns inside them remain unexplained. The petrified stumps documented by Lhote remain classified as unusual rock formations despite the visible growth rings in cross-section photographs that were never officially published, but survive in private collections. The compression layer of organic material spanning 400,000 square miles remains officially described as anomalous without any proposed mechanism for how that anomaly might have occurred naturally at that scale and depth. And every institution that has encountered this evidence has chosen the same response: file it, reclassify it, decline follow-up, ensure that the official narrative remains intact, that the desert stays empty in the public imagination, and that the questions raised by the physical record never quite coalesce into a coherent alternative explanation that would require textbooks to be rewritten and timelines to be reconsidered. The real question isn't whether advanced machinery existed in the pre-classical world. The evidence for that is already on the ground, written into the landscape in cuts too regular and too sustained to be anything but mechanical. The real question is who controlled it, where the machinery went when the operation ended, and why every culture that came afterward, Egyptian, Greek, Roman and European colonial powers alike, agreed to pretend the desert had always been empty. Step back from the physical evidence for a moment and examine the institutional response. Every major archaeological expedition to the Sahara between 1880 and 1950 was funded by a remarkably narrow cluster of European industrial families. The same names appear across expedition donor lists, museum board appointments, and colonial resource extraction contracts. Families that control Mediterranean shipping networks, North African mining operations, and early petroleum exploration concessions across Egypt, Libya, and Algeria. Their institutional archives are sealed or listed as lost. The French Geographical Society records covering North African expeditions from 1885 to 1935 are classified as unavailable for public research, with no specified release date. The Royal Geographical Society collections covering the same period and region show systematic gaps. Entire expeditions documented in member correspondence and funding records, but absent from the published proceedings. This isn't a research gap, it's a research border. Someone decided what could be studied and what needed to remain beneath the threshold of academic inquiry. The ancient texts tell their own story through what they refuse to clarify. Egyptian temple inscriptions reference the great cutting in ritualized language that never specifies what was cut or where. The phrase appears across multiple dynasties, always in contexts involving timber supply and temple construction, but never with geographic specificity. Carthaginian trade records recovered from archaeological sites mention the Western harvest in financial ledgers that detail quantities and costs, but omit origin points. Greek historian Herodotus, writing around 440 BCE, mentions in passing the lands where the tall trees stood while discussing North African geography, then never returns to the subject. He provides detailed accounts of Egyptian monuments, Persian imperial administration, and Scythian burial practices, but the Western forest gets one line and no follow-up. Later, Roman records show something more deliberate than omission: complete silence. Roman engineers and administrators documented everything: aqueduct construction, road building, grain shipment logistics, military supply chains. They recorded the dimensions of trees used in siege equipment and naval construction. But references to Saharan timber supply that appear in earlier Carthaginian and Greek sources vanish entirely from Roman documentation after approximately 200 BCE. The topic doesn't disappear gradually as interest wanes. It vanishes abruptly, as if an institutional decision was made to stop discussing it in official records. The trans-Saharan trade routes are always explained as connecting sub-Saharan Africa to Mediterranean markets. Gold, salt, slaves and ivory moving north, manufactured goods moving south. But the routes don't optimize for that function. Map the major caravan routes against the satellite imagery of the trench systems and the circular depressions. The routes trace the edges of the trench networks, not the shortest paths between population centres. Caravan stops align precisely with the circular depression sites, even in locations that offer no natural advantages for rest stops, no reliable water sources, no defensive positions, no agricultural potential. These weren't trade routes built across a desert to connect distant markets. These were service roads built alongside an industrial zone, designed to move extracted material from processing sites to distribution points. And they stayed functional long after the operation ended because the infrastructure was already there. Packed earth road beds, stone markers, water cache systems built to supply work crews. Later traders used them because they existed, not because anyone remembered what they'd originally served. In the 1960s, Algerian National Oil Company survey teams documented clusters of what they called cylindrical rock formations in deep Saharan basin regions that showed promising seismic indicators for petroleum deposits. The formations measured 15 to 60 feet in height and 10 to 40 feet in diameter. Vertical grain patterns were visible in cross-section where erosion or drilling had exposed the internal structure. The formations were officially classified as sedimentary columns, mineral deposits built up through water percolation and chemical precipitation over geological timescales. The problem is that sedimentary columns don't have growth rings, but these formations did. An independent petrologist working outside the petroleum industry published analysis in a regional North African geology journal concluding that the formations were fossilized tree stumps from specimens between 200 and 400 feet tall. The journal had limited circulation and no international indexing. The analysis was never cited in mainstream geological literature. When a French documentary team tried to film the formations in 2011, they were denied permits by regional authorities citing environmental protection regulations in an area that had no protected status and no endangered species listings. Modern botany provides clear parameters. Trees of that scale require specific soil chemistry, rainfall levels above 800 millimeters annually, and atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations substantially higher than present levels. The Sahara 5,000 years ago had a wetter climate than today. Paleoclimate data confirms that, but not wet enough to support megaflora of this scale. The rainfall estimates for the African humid period peak around 6000 BCE suggest conditions capable of supporting savanna and open woodland, not forests with individual specimens reaching 400 feet in height, unless the atmosphere itself was different. Geological ice core data from Greenland and Antarctica shows carbon dioxide fluctuation spikes around 2800 BCE that don't align with known volcanic events or oceanic methane release patterns. The spikes are sharp, concentrated, and geographically localized to atmospheric circulation patterns that would have originated from the North African region. They align with massive organic combustion, burning or decomposition on a continental scale. The standard explanation attributes the fluctuations to measurement error or unidentified natural variability, but the timing matches exactly with the midpoint of the compressed organic layer in Saharan rock strata. If an industrial timber operation of this scale existed, the requirements become very specific. Centralized logistics capable of coordinating extraction across thousands of square miles, fuel sources sufficient to power mechanical systems, likely the timber itself burned to drive steam or combustion engines, labor forces in the tens of thousands sustained across multiple generations with housing, food supply, and social organization. A governing structure capable of multi-generational coordination, planning extraction rates decades in advance, and maintaining operational continuity as individual administrators aged out and were replaced. And then it stopped. Not gradually as resources declined and operations scaled down. Abruptly. The compressed organic layer shows sharp termination, depths that indicate active operations followed immediately by rapid burial with no transitional phase of reduced activity. The abandonment appears to have occurred around 1200 BCE, the same narrow window known as the Late Bronze Age collapse. Within 50 years, the Mycenaean palaces fell, the Hittite Empire disintegrated, Egyptian centralized authority fractured, and trade networks that had functioned for centuries collapsed simultaneously across the eastern Mediterranean. Official history attributes the collapse to sea peoples, unidentified maritime raiders, and climate stress. But it offers no mechanism for why climate stress would produce synchronized collapse across regions with different agricultural systems and different vulnerabilities. It doesn't explain where the sea peoples came from, why they appeared suddenly with no prior historical presence, or where they went afterward. It doesn't explain the economic mechanisms that would allow multiple state systems to fail within the same generation. What if the Sahara wasn't a climate victim? What if it was an exhausted resource zone? The timber that had fed Mediterranean construction for nearly 2,000 years was gone. The industrial operation that had supplied it reached the terminal point where remaining resources no longer justified operational costs. The machinery didn't vanish, it was dismantled with components either buried at the work sites or transported to regions where they could be repurposed for other extraction industries, metal mining, quarrying, or early petroleum surface collection operations that would later be described as natural seeps. The labor forces didn't disappear into archaeological silence. They scattered. Tens of thousands of workers and their families displaced simultaneously would have appeared in the collapsing Bronze Age states as refugees, economic migrants, and displaced populations seeking new employment. The historical record shows exactly that. Population movements, displaced peoples, and social disruption concentrated in the narrow window of the Late Bronze Age collapse. The official story calls them invaders. Another reading calls them unemployed workers. The governing authorities didn't fall, they pivoted, from timber extraction to metal extraction to petroleum extraction, same families controlling Mediterranean trade networks, same institutional structures managing resource access, same pattern of selective record keeping that documents the products but obscures the supply chains. The families that funded the Saharan expeditions in the 1880s were the same families that held colonial mining concessions and later petroleum exploration rights. The institutional silence isn't coincidence, it's continuity. This interpretation has gaps and they need to be acknowledged plainly. We don't have a single intact machine. We don't have administrative records with clear institutional signatures. We don't have a named empire or a capital city or a coinage system that would allow us to trace economic flows with precision. What we do have is tool marks that require mechanical explanation. petrified stumps at a scale modern forests don't produce, industrial waste layers across 400,000 square miles, trade routes that make no sense unless something was being moved in bulk across distances that required permanent infrastructure, and 3,000 years of institutional refusal to investigate the physical evidence that contradicts the official timeline. Examine other ancient deserts with similar geological anomalies. The Gobi Desert contains parallel trench systems in Mongolia's southern regions, visible in satellite imagery but officially unexplained. The Australian outback shows massive circular depressions in the interior, classified as salt lakes despite the absence of salt deposits, and the presence of radial scarring patterns identical to the Mauritanian formations. The Atacama Desert in Chile has geometric ground scars visible only from aerial survey, documented during Chilean military mapping operations in the 1970s, and subsequently restricted from civilian research access. Every one of these formations was discovered during early 20th century resource surveys, petroleum, mineral, or strategic military reconnaissance. Everyone was filed away as natural formations, and everyone is located in regions that later became military zones, restricted access areas, or territories where civilian research requires government permits that are systematically denied. The pattern repeats across continents. The response is identical. Document, classify as natural, restrict access, decline follow-up. The trenches in the Western Sahara are still there. You can see them on Google Earth if you know the coordinates. 23.4 degrees north, 11.2 degrees west will put you close enough to begin searching. They're labelled erosional features in the metadata. The satellites that photograph them are owned by corporations that can be traced through subsidiary holdings back to the same industrial families that funded the original archaeological expeditions. The desert didn't erase the evidence. The evidence is what created the desert. And the same institutions that managed the extraction managed the explanation. The official story survived because it was useful. It required no uncomfortable reassessment of technological timelines, no acknowledgement of industrial-scale resource depletion in the pre-classical world, and no questions about who benefited from the operation or where the governing structures went when the work was finished. A single satellite frame shows 40 miles of parallel grooves cutting through sand, ancient, visible, unexplained, still marked natural formation in every geological database, still there.